Right. Everybody, welcome to today's live. And I'm going to be honest with you up front. Today is not going to be a lighthearted, easy to digest topic. So if you're looking for fun and amusement, we might want to move on now. But today I want to pose a question for all of you. And that question is, what if we could all make huge strides towards dramatically improving our race relations in the United States and around the world, and also, while doing so, subject ourselves to fewer and fewer feelings of angered, feelings of anger, hatred, feelings of fear, feelings of judgment. And in this video, I want to share with you the one simple character trait and the one simple behavior that I believe, by making this behavior more of a habit in our day-to-day thoughts and our day-to-day interactions, that will allow you, it'll allow me, it'll allow all of us to honestly have the possibility of truly creating a better world. And I want to start out today by getting a few things out of the way. The first thing is that I am far from an expert on race relations in the United States. And I'm certainly not fully equipped to provide a solution to everything that we're going through right now. I also need to mention that I fully recognize and that I acknowledge that these words that you're hearing today, that you're seeing, are coming from a white male who grew up rather firmly entrenched in the middle class in rural Pennsylvania, is where I grew up. And that my upbringing, and really my entire life, I've had advantages that haven't been afforded to people who don't look like me. And I get that, and I recognize that, and I acknowledge that. And no, I have not directly experienced so many of the things that I see people describing on social media that are persons of color that are experiencing these things that I've never had to experience. And I acknowledge that. And no, I've not experienced those things. And I am also regularly seeking to try to understand these perspectives. And to a small, minute, limited degree, I have been exposed to observing many examples of this mistreatment and of racial inequality in practice. I don't talk about this a lot, but there are a handful of people who know about me that I have spent over a decade ago, but still I had spent a short period of time in my life in the correction system, not as an employee or an advisor or a member of the staff, but as a guest. And it was a very short time, but during that very short time, I got to see some of these obscene practices and behaviors and some of the norms of our so-called justice system, and how disproportionately it negatively impacts people of color. And honestly, it contributed largely to why I am and have been so kind of anti-government in a lot of my outspokenness over the years, because I saw how the system treated people who are disadvantaged, be that economically disadvantaged, or a person of color who isn't afforded the things that I've been afforded as a white man. And lastly, I want to acknowledge that I agree it is not enough to just be not racist. And it's not enough to just say, well, I'm not racist, and that's okay. And I'm 100% in favor of being and acting in the interest of anti-racism. And everything that I want to talk about today is in that spirit. And if I can get a little analytical for a second, how I think about racism from an outsider's perspective, somebody who hasn't experienced it themselves, from the perspective of somebody who simply seeks to better understand what others are going through, and understand the conditions that cause it, understand what triggers the thoughts and the behaviors in people who are behaving in a racist, bigoted manner, what and how those thoughts manifest themselves in people's actions, how we need to understand how it becomes so systemic and how racism can actually become institutionalized. All of these things that I'm trying to understand, coming from somebody who can't possibly experience it, are all in an effort to want to really solve the problem. And I know that sounds silly and simplistic, but I want to acknowledge also that our problems with racism, even just if we look inside our country in the United States, our problems with racism are nuanced, they're complex, and because of that, they do not have simple solutions. Nuanced, complex problems usually do not have simple solutions. Despite what some politicians or some community leaders or other people would like you to believe, that they could just pass a law or do this one thing and all of your problems will be solved. There is no just pass this law or just do this one thing and our problems will be solved. Sure, certain laws and certain movements will help, but a problem of this scale, of this long-ranging history, and a problem that is so deeply rooted in human behavior will not be solved, in my opinion, through talk, through grandstanding. We can really only hope to resolve complex problems like this through actual changes in human behavior. And while I am not an expert in experiencing racism, I'm not an expert in race relations in the United States, I do know a thing or two about human behavior and behavioral patterns, and I'm continually learning about these things. And that's what today's video is about how can we change our own behavior individually to affect greater change. And so I say all that to say that the way that in my analytical engineer mind that I view racism as a very potent, very specifically targeted form of anger, hate, and fear. That's how I see racism as a condition in this country and in any country, is a very potent, very targeted form of anger, form of hate, form of fear. And I want to warn you that at times what I'm going to talk about in this video, as I'm looking at my outline, at times what I'm going to say might seem and come off a little cold, a little emotionless, and it might at times even feel almost clinical, but I promise you that it's not devoid of emotions. Rather, the opposite is true. And it might seem like the engineer in me is coming out a little bit, but again, going back to like just trying to understand in order to help solve the problem, I promise you it's the opposite of emotionless. People who do truly know me know that, first of all, I experience basically every emotion, all of my emotions turned up to 11. There aren't things that I just kind of feel. But the other reason why I might seem so cold and analytical at times is that I'm really biased towards action. And I'll admit that thoughts are nice, and admitting our feelings and our emotions and our impressions are all well and good. But at the same time, I also believe that talk is cheap, and that change, real change, only happens through action. And so I wanted to think about things and think about everything that's going on right now, which is such a huge issue that I can't possibly wrap my head around it or even communicate it in one video. But I wanted to think about things and present the best suggestions that I could think of that would allow all of us to really seek improvement and to actually achieve improvement and progress through our actual actions. So to circle back to the original reason why we're here, which I mentioned is the single behavior that I think can actually help us, I would submit to you that anytime that we're in a state where we are passing judgment about others, anytime we're in a state where we're acting out of fear, out of anger, out of hatred, most of the time we are in that state and we're doing that. We're passing judgment. We're acting out of fear or hatred or anger. We're doing so because we are highly certain about a number of things. We're certain that somebody else wronged us, maybe. Or maybe we're certain that we're in danger, or that something about our lives is in danger, or that we're unsafe. Or we're certain that somebody is just a certain way, maybe because of their gender, or we think it's because of the color of their skin, or because of some identifying characteristic that triggers a bias in us, sometimes even a bias that we didn't even know that we had. And sometimes the certainty is actually useful, maybe not in these cases, but we use this certainty and the snap judgment that we have in order to save time in our decision making and to go about our lives without having to stop and reconsider every single impression that we have. But I would add that in these cases where we're so certain about someone or something that it leads us to these destructive emotions and these destructive behaviors, then that's the time where I believe it's most productive to challenge this internal certainty that we have and to instead become curious. So curious is going to be the name of the game in this video. And I would ask you to think about a time recently, maybe, think about a time where you were angry, where you were fearful, where you're maybe even hateful of somebody else or somebody else's actions, and you attributed it to some gross generalization. And I've just got a list here, not things for me, but maybe your gross generalization was that men can't be trusted, or women are just like that, or every Black person I know is unreliable, or all guys are players. And I'm not saying any of these are true, by the way. I'm just saying these are generalizations that sometimes we develop in ourselves. Excuse me 1 second. I've got a dog recovering from surgery and he's doing his best to get my attention. So think about these gross generalizations that you have. And maybe at that time you felt that somebody wronged you or somebody threatened you, and you attribute that feeling that you have to one of these defining characteristics. They're a man, or they're Black, or they're Hispanic, or they're a woman, or they're from this socioeconomical background. And you attribute that to one of these defining characteristics because you want to think, well, of course that happened. He's a man and he can't be trusted, because that gives us more certainty, right? And these honestly are just lies or half-truths even that we tell ourselves and that we convince ourselves of because, well, it's easier to close ourselves off from the actual truth and to just stick with our certainty and our judgments than it is to actually question our judgments. Because if you question our judgments, well, where do we go from there, right? You could rabbit hole all day on that. So I would ask you, when you've been in a time where you've been angry or fearful and you've attributed some behavior of somebody else to one of these gross generalizations, I would ask you, what if instead you started becoming curious about that other person's life conditions, their background? What if instead of assuming the reasons that somebody wronged you, which you're so certain about, what if you ask yourselves, what else could this mean? One of my favorite questions ever is to ask yourself, they did this because of this reason. They did this because they don't like me. They did this because they're a guy and they can't be trusted. They did this for this reason. What if instead you asked yourself, this thing happened. What else could this mean? Could they be going through a tough time themselves? Could they have similar judgments and generalizations about me even? Could I be completely misinterpreting the intent that they had in what they did? Is it possible that they felt hurt or threatened in that moment and then behaved in a way that they did because it was a defense mechanism in order to defend themselves. You know, I love the saying that hurt people hurt people. And I'm not pretending that any of this exercising of curiosity and behaving in a curious manner, I'm not pretending that it's easy. It's really not easy, which is kind of the point of me sharing this with you today. It took me a bit of courage to do so. I mean, if this was easy to do, to challenge our judgments and to behave in a curious manner, then I wouldn't have to have this video, because we would all be curious all the time and we wouldn't be judging people so strongly. So it's not easy, but it is necessary. It's necessary if we ever hope to grow beyond our own biases that have been rooted in us for years, for decades, since we were kids, right? Getting genuinely, authentically curious about learning more about other people, rather than just sitting and stewing in that certainty that we have about why people are a certain way, things that we know to be true. Honestly, that curiosity is really it's the only path to growth. And individually and at a larger global level, it's the only path to change. So I had this outlined and I went a little bit outside of my outline because I did not want to completely go off the rails. But in closing, I just want to leave you with this. Understand that we all have patterns that are ingrained into our behaviors, into our minds, into our psyche. And these patterns were placed and left with us usually over the span of years and years and years. And some of the patterns that we have serve us, right? Like sometimes we keep ourselves safe. Sometimes we do things that benefit ourselves through these patterns. And then some of these patterns really do not serve us, and they don't serve others. Some of the patterns are harmful to us, and some of the patterns we have are harmful to others. So I will leave you with this one thing, which is to challenge you to do simply one thing. And that's to identify an area in your life where you might be prone to making snap judgments. Snap judgments based on, again, the gross generalizations maybe that you have about people, or you might resort to an unhealthier or a set of emotions that don't serve you. Maybe where you feel anger, pain, fear, hate, and where you're so certain about why somebody did something or why somebody is about to do something. Identify one area in your life where that happens. Maybe write it down if you have to. And then once you've identified that area, think about that one area where you're quick to snap to judgment. Think about, what if I was curious? What if I amplified my curiosity in that moment and tried to find out more about that person, where they were coming from, why they were doing what they were doing? And think about one way to be curious instead. How would that change the situation? What might it change in you? How could it impact others? So find that one area where you, generally speaking, will snap to judgment and instead exercise curiosity and think about the ways that if just by being curious, you might be able to impact yourself and the lives of others. And if you do that, I think you might actually surprise yourself by what you'll find. So at that, I'll leave you at that and go take care of my post-op puppy here, who's going nuts, which you can probably hear in the background. Thank you for paying attention to me and watching this. Again, I'm far from the expert on this matter, but I wanted to kind of give you my thought process that's been just driving me crazy over the last couple of days, and wanting to share one actionable way that I thought we could all make progress towards a better future. So with that, I wish you well. Thanks again for watching. Cheers.